Welcome to The Numbers Game. I'm here with Nick, and today we've actually got another one of our guest episodes, and we're being joined by someone who's lived through some of the toughest moments in sports and business. This person is a leadership strategist, CEO advisor, and founder of Design CEO. We have Cameron Schwab. He has an organization dedicated to helping leaders grow, lead with authenticity, and build high-performing cultures. Now, if you're an AFL fan, you're probably familiar with Cameron's story of starting as the youngest CEO ever in AFL history. At 24 years old, he was the CEO of the Richmond Football Club, and then went on to be the CEO of Melbourne and Fremantle through arguably some of the toughest times through their histories of those clubs. He's cleared millions of debt. He's rebuilt supporter engagement. He's grown revenue, and he's learned firsthand what leadership looks like in high pressure, high stake environments. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Cameron Schwab to the show.
Oh, thanks very much, Jason, and thanks very much, Nick. Good to meet you all.
Thanks for coming on.
Great to have you here. And I wanted to start off with, you've got quite an epic background. You've got quite a journey. But if I ask you, what are you most proud of? What comes to mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first thing I think is pride sort of can cut both ways a little bit. Sometimes pride can get in the road of important things. You know, we can be too proud to own up, too proud to admit, too proud to recognise that the world's always going to throw stuff at us, which is something different to what we would have hoped and expected. So I'm thinking of pride in a love sense. You know, that as in something that you actually would reflect on from a place of love or a place of decency rather than a place of ego would probably be my first take on it. So I think probably the raising of children is always the thing that I reflect, firstly on, that I've got children now, that I've got a relationship that I'm pleased that I have got. We certainly don't live out of each other's pockets, but we're definitely there for the moments that matter. And then in terms of the work I've done, it's probably just the fact that the organisations and the clubs, one that I was really proud to have been given the opportunity that I had to actually lead those clubs as a CEO. And the one thing about sporting clubs is that it's very much a shared leadership model. You have presidents, you have boards, you have CEOs, you have coaches. So there's a complexity inside that. That you've been able to sort of carry the weight forward would be the way I'd describe it. That there's, when you take on a role like that, there's obviously a lot which has gone before you. And, say, for instance, the Melbourne Football Club you're sitting in the same chair, in a metaphoric sense, as the person who created the game itself, which is a guy by the name of Tom Wheels, wrote the first rules of football, and then the Melbourne Football Club's formed. He's the first secretary of the club. The secretaries become the general managers, become the CEOs. It's just title inflation, same job, really, in lots of ways. But that you actually sat in the same chair as the person who I'm sure he had no idea what it would actually become, but there's a weight which he created and then was carried forward by a lot of remarkable people over a long period of time. And I'd like to think that I carried that weight forward in a way where it was, it certainly wasn't all positive, that's for sure. And very much readily own up to the errors and the mistakes that you make, mostly errors of judgment, I would think. But I was able to carry the weight forward that those clubs were able to benefit from at least the period of time that I was there in some tangible way. And but never ever overestimating your own little piece of history as well. So it's, I felt very honoured just to have been given the opportunities that I did to actually work in the game that I loved in environments which a lot of people loved and cared for. And we're able to have some moments and share those moments together. But I think it's that idea of carrying the weight forward, which is the thing that I think perhaps most about now. I'm now 61, so you probably get that, you've had more of life to actually reflect upon. And that's what I think about. Does that make sense? It's a fairly, I hope it's not too esoteric and vague, but I think as you get older, you're more, you think more about that.
Yeah, I don't think there's too many people I could throw a question that deep at and expect them to be able to reel an answer off. So, and even as you're talking, I think, a few nods from Nick, who's recently become a father as well, and probably can start to appreciate the varying difference between proud of, business accomplishments and, career accomplishments versus being a dad, but might pass to Nick to take it from there.
We even see it obviously with myself and even people that work in our business, becoming a parent, just your whole perspective on life changes almost. For everyone, that will be a
Yeah.
little bit different, but definitely.
I think it does. It does. It is different for different people, and I think, yeah, and I think probably the perspective you bring is the recognition of the role your own parents played in your own life. You know, that somehow, if you're not careful, you think of that as being different to the role that you get to then play in someone else's life. You know that. Yeah, there's no doubt that the two major influences on my life were my mum and my dad, and definitely came from, you know, a position of privilege in that I had two loving parents, you know, as a starting point. And, you know, and I know that's not something that's something that we can't take for granted. And probably the two enduring loves of my life in the things that I got to do and be, um, football was through my father, who was a very, very prominent person in the game. And I got to have an exposure to the sport, you know, at a much deeper level than perhaps most people would have had. And my mum's an artist and a painter, and I got to study fine art. I did that later in life, but it was always part of who I am. And I think in some ways I got to combine the two things, because I think creativity is such an important aspect of what we do as leaders, which is often very much underestimated in regard to that. But you know, I think both my parents were creative, but in different ways. In mum in the more traditional way that we would view creativity, but my father had an enormous influence on the game. Was the reason why we have things like salary caps and drafts and a national competition and these things. He was at the AFL or the VFL becoming the AFL. He was the, you know, executive commissioner of the AFL during that period of time. So that's why I talk about that idea of privilege, is that I didn't lack for love, that was for sure, but I also didn't lack. You know, they shared with me, you know, the things that, you know, their love of something, which I then got to carry forward as well.
And I think the thing for me, Cameron, has been just the realization of the responsibility that you hold, and you just said it then, but the impact that you're going to have on that child's outcome, um, and life. So it's almost like this wow moment where there's ultimate responsibility. Obviously, there's, with business and whatnot, there's other levels of responsibility, but you're dealing with adults who also need to bear some of that responsibility themselves. So when someone is so vulnerable and it's pretty much all up to you, yeah, it's a very it's a big change. It's a big change.
Yeah, well, one of my favourite lines I do throw at my kids, I say, if it's nature or nurture, it's both my fault. But at some stage, you've got to work your own shit out.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is that. There's the nature comes obviously via the DNA. The nurture comes from the, how good we were, and and don't worry, you make lots of mistakes along the way.
Yeah.
As much as you try. And it is also often at a phase of life where you're actually trying to be good at something else. It's at a time where probably the most productive period of your working life really is in that parenting phase as well, where you get to actually have, hopefully, make enough impact, get good enough at something that it can actually carry you forward probably in a different way. Often, I think the first phase of, probably up until your early to mid 40s from the time we probably, we're conscious of a life beyond school, in the formal structures, and we realize we have to be something or do something. I think that first, up until that phase, is the getting good phase, whereas after that, it's more of the making good. It's more about your wisdom, and it's more about, what you actually bring from the experiences of getting good. And one of the things that we have to get good at is parenting. And then when your kids get to a certain phase, it tends to be more the wisdom that you bring for them in their adult life. And I love the conversations I get to have with my kids now, because they're experiencing adult things, and, you actually get to play a role a little bit more. There's obviously integrity in the relationship, because it comes from a place of love, but there's also perhaps insight that you can actually help them as they find their own way through, their own experiences of trying to create a career and trying to create a life for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'd suggest your 40s, the way I've been thinking about it. That's where you capitalize on everything you've done. It's time to kind of make good,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
almost bring everything together, you know?
If we're not careful, though, we still sort of get caught up in a bit of the tick the box. I have to have done a certain thing by a certain stage. And I went back to uni in my 50s and studied fine art, which was not part of the plan, I can assure you. And, but it was, I wouldn't have swapped that one for anything. And, and I get to, get the benefit of that still, as we were talking about before.
I guess on the the age and doing things a little bit different, uni in your 50s, probably for a bit of background, Cameron presented, and Nick, I don't know if I told you as well, but Cameron presented at the CPA retreat down in Torquay. Fantastic presentation. I think it was in the arena, or leading in the arena. Was the title of the presentation. But one of the things, I wasn't a big AFL fan, but haven't necessarily known a great deal about, your background or anything specific around CEOs and AFL clubs. But, I'd love, for a bit of context from the journey of, where you started, the position you got to, and then, going into later life now around design CEO. But take us back to 1988, where as a 24-year-old, you become, the CEO of the Richmond Football Club. How does someone at the age of 24 get that amount of responsibility?
Yeah, well, you wouldn't do it probably now, and I don't think it will happen again. It was again, it's often situation and circumstances, opportunities, often are there. And one of the concepts I really, I coach to it a little bit now, is this idea of you're never ready. If you spend your life waiting to be ready, and the conversation often is, were you ready? Well, clearly at that age, you're not in terms of a lot of the things the role's actually going to ask of you. But I was actually quite ready in other ways, which might sound unusual, a little bit because of the background that I had, that I grew up in and around the game at a pretty heavy level. My father, before going to the VFL as it was then, was the secretary of the Richmond Football Club, as I said, title inflation CEO. And it was a period of time where Richmond were the greatest club. They were the big club. Had an enormous rivalry with Carlton during that period, but they basically exchanged premierships for the best part of 10 years. And it's very it's still a rivalry which is spoken about within those clubs. So there were 3 times in my childhood that I can remember that I woke up on a Sunday morning in the Premiership Cup. The Tigers had won the day before, were sitting on our kitchen table. That's basically the life I had, and so each regularly, mostly on Sunday mornings, all games were played on Saturdays, that the great Richmond coach of that era, a fellow named Tom Hafey, who's an iconic person in the game, would either come around to our place, or we'd go around to his place, or they'd meet at the Punt Road Oval in Richmond. And Dad and Tommy, no replay, would almost replay the game to themselves. And I'd be sitting there as a young fella, and I'd be taking it all in. And because the game, I fell in love with the game before perhaps I fell in love with anything. I think superheroes might have been about the same time. I still do love my Batman. And one of the major connections I have with, my youngest is the superheroes. Actually, that's the things we still have conversations about. Sounds silly, but it is. And then I was watching, there's a show on television called World of Sport, and it was basically a roundup of whatever happened the day before. And there's a great Richmond person by the name of Kevin Sheedy, who's a great Richmond player. And he was on the handball championship, and he was explaining how he handballed the game. And after the championship, he was described as a student of the game. That's how they described him, that Kevin Sheedy's a student of the game. And I remember looking and I was probably 10 or 11 and thinking, that's the thing I want to be. I want to be a student of the game. And I never had any sense that it would take me anywhere, because I'd go into my father's work on school holidays, and that was at the Punt Road Oval. And he was almost the only person working there full time, it shows you how much the game's changed. But this is the best club in the competition, with 1 or 2 full-time people. So I don't think of myself as having any prospects of a career in the sport. But then halfway through year 12, with no real sense of what I wanted to do, there's an ad in the paper for a job titled assistant to the football manager of the Melbourne Football Club. It wasn't assistant football manager, it was assistant to. So it was like, just, I'm going to help this person out, basically. And the very first day, and I get the job, and my surname being Schwab probably played a fairly major role in it, not just on sort of the nepotism of, we're going to look after one of the highest profile people in the game's son, but I think they did recognise that I had grown up in quite a unique way, in this sense. And the coach of the club's Ron Barassi, he probably is the most famous name the game's ever produced. So I go from Tom Hafey to Ron Barassi and I'm 18 years of age, and I'm watching him coach one day or edit. He's using a video to coach the players, and if the meeting goes for an hour, I reckon half of the meeting's Ron Barassi rewinding and fast forwarding the videotape. So. And the other thing I love is music, like a lot of people. And I used to make mixtapes, tape to tape, and you'd make these mixtapes. And I offered to edit out Ron Barassi's tapes for him. And I did that. And he looked at me like I was a freaky genius when I just turned up with this tape that I did edit out. And I'm now like almost the technology manager of the Melbourne Footy Club, and I'm 18. This is all happening for me. But it puts me in daily conversation with Ron, because I'd then actually say to him at different times, there was another time that happened, or this, would I put that? He just kept on encouraging me. If I saw something in the game when I was editing it, just to put it on the tape. And so he had this enormous, and I think almost without any shadow of doubt, is the most important things which have ever happened to me are when people have seen things in me that I had yet to see in myself. And Ron then suggested I go recruiting. And I thought recruiting was for, these Yoda figures in footy, these wise old people. But I'm like 18 or 19. And by the time I'm 20, I'm a full-time recruiting person at Melbourne. And I was the first one to do that at the club. I started to get a little bit of a rep, and I get a tap on the shoulder one day, would you be interested in coming to Richmond? I thought it was to do recruiting. And they said, no, we want you to be the CEO. And Richmond at that point, they'd won the premiership 7 years earlier, but by now they're on the bottom of the ladder and they're also broke. They're going out of business, basically one of the most powerful clubs in the competition. It was a huge fall. And the thing is, and you guys would relate to this, is that I went straight from school. I didn't do a business subject at school. And I knew there were two things which seemed important, but that one was called a profit and loss statement, the other one was called a balance sheet. But I had no idea what either of them were, So, but I was at the meeting where they were interviewing me for the role, and I said, "Can I see them?" And in the next meeting we catch up, and they do, and I look at them, I have no idea what I'm looking at, but I could tell by all the worried looks of the people in the room that it wasn't very good. So I said, "It's not very good, is it?" And they said, "No, it's not." And I remember ringing my dad up on the way home, and I said, "Dad, I don't think it's a very good job. They're last on the ladder. They're broke." And he said, and he always called me China. My whole life, Dad, it was China. China plate, mate, rhyming slang, China. I'm you're my little mate, so you're my China plate. So I was just China, yeah. And I still love the fact that happened, And I said, "Dad, I don't think it's a very good job." And he said, "China, if it was a very good job, they wouldn't be asking you." Is exactly what he said to me. And in saying it, he was totally right. But the best jobs are the ones which, in many cases, aren't the very good jobs. And then he was very reassuring of what I brought, and and how, and I just loved the Tigers. And so I did it for 7 years, and it was a very defining period of life, obviously, to do something like that. The club, we managed to do a few things, and that's that idea of the weight carried forward. We did a thing called the SOS campaign, which, to save the club. We made the finals for the first time in a long time. And so I think that is the idea of the weight carried forward. But it was also a time my father actually died suddenly. So that happened during that period as well. He misadventure would probably be the best way of describing how he died. And he was a iconic Richmond person. So there was just a lot of things happening for me at that phase of my life. So I have this, I remember enormous amount of lessons learned, but I basically had my lifetime job between the ages of 24 and 31. Yeah. And so I got to be the CEO of two other clubs and had just as much passion and love and care and all of that for those clubs because I did. But it was always going to be, I knew that it was always going to be probably the context from which the rest of my career would be measured in one way or another.
So on that journey, obviously some amazing roles, and Jace mentioned earlier, but going in and clearing debt, and we all know what that can do to a business's cash flow and viability, and then driving revenues, 300% plus. Obviously amazing, turn them into amazing businesses, I guess. But being around sport clubs myself as I was younger, understanding the value culture and leadership have, and particularly I'm just thinking about you coming into a job like that at age 24. Like the culture, I can assume the culture wasn't great at Richmond when you went in there, neither the leadership. But what, like, you've obviously been able to transfer that or change that. So what are the key things that you've learnt over the years in regards to culture and leadership, and then how do they relate to business? Because it's the same, really, sporting clubs and business to a degree.
Yeah, I think there's a danger in definition that I think of culture as an outcome. That's the first thing. Yeah, I think of team as an outcome. So what are the inputs basically? Well, who you let in the room is the biggest input. Yeah, so who you let in the room and why they're there. Yeah, are they there for the right reasons? And I think sometimes we overrate the importance of how team-based we have to actually be. There's some people say, we want to be a great team here, whereas really, and then I actually ask them to describe what sort of team they want to be. Are they a great relay team? That means just do your job really well and hand it over really well. It's a different dynamic, for example, than being a great cricket team, which is much more individually based and very binary. And if you're not making runs, you can't play type scenario. Whereas the football codes are very team oriented, as in I might have to sacrifice my role for you, and very often, I can remember, say, for instance, when I was at Fremantle, we had a couple of star forwards, Matthew Pavlich, Jeff Farmer were great players of that era. And they might say, Pav was quiet today. And I say, yeah, but Chris Mayne kicked 6. You reckon that didn't happen without Matthew Pavlich there, And so it's much more team and sacrifice than that. So working out what sort of culture you need to drive the strategy or the thing you're seeking to achieve. And there's an old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I used to roll that out like I was some sort of expert. Then I realized it was bullshit. And then, I got to study at Harvard with the bloke who actually wrote that, so which is quite amazing. Because I think strategically we have to choose what sort of culture we need to build and have to actually achieve the thing that we're seeking to achieve. And clearly in a football club, there are also their cultures and their subcultures. The culture we need to build within the football team, whilst there'll be shared values and shared expectations, is a very different culture that we build in our marketing department or our community team or our finance area, whatever it might be. And so we do agree, and we agree to a set of principles by which we're going to, seek to achieve the thing that we're seeking to achieve. We align to those principles, but we actually recognise that things like conflict and ambiguity and uncertainty and all of these things are a natural context for, if you like, any environment which is in a high-performance world, such as elite sport. And so one of the things which it took me too long to work out is that you can't trust your feelings, but you can learn to trust your principles, as in often your feelings will betray you at different times. They'll take you to a place of anger, or they'll take you to a place of, ego, or whereas I say, if you're clear on your principles, if you learn to operate and work and remind yourself of those, and we all agree with those. So it's really, if we've got a principle of, even courage and even ideas around authenticity, well, authenticity I think of as an outcome. You can't be authentic unless you're prepared to be vulnerable, because that's the human condition, and there's no vulnerability without courage. So if we say, okay, one of the expectations is that if you're going to lead here, you're going to have to be a courageous leader. But fear will kick in. There will be times you will be fearful. You'll be fearful of a conversation you have to have. Like I've had to have conversations with coaches where I tell them that you're no longer coach of the club. And you don't sleep very well that night. But the one thing I've learned is it's much harder to be told that than to tell that. And so you have that empathy then for it, but that will ask for bravery, And so I hope this is not a long-winded way, but I don't think at any stage can you outperform what you bring as a leader. And often, if you've got your hands on the levers like a CEO does, the culture will be the outcome of how you play that hand, if you like, and there are so many different cultures which have been born out of different, and people will often say, I want a culture like that one over there. I go, yeah, we can learn from it. And I've got to study with, Barcelona and the All Blacks and, Liverpool and Everton and Green Bay Packers and all these great clubs, which have been admired for their culture. And you certainly learn from it. But the one thing I worked out is you can't put it in a suitcase and bring it home with you. You've got to create your own version of that. And so if all of us created a business together, well, it's going to be, in one way or another, at least in part, an expression of our collective behaviours. And so therefore we say, what are the behaviours we want to really focus on here? What are the important behaviours? And I think they go to ideas around principles such as calm, brave, humble, compassionate. I think those are universal, I reckon, because they're the things that it's going to ask of you in a moment when you're going to feel fear, or you're going to get yourself into a place where you're not bringing the best of yourself because, there's, the red haze is, just crossed, you've got angry or whatever it might be. And so therefore you bring people into your organisation who can align, and it's not necessarily agree, because agree is a bit different. We're going to argue at different times, we get that, but we're going to align with the principles of the organisation. And at least if we do that, we're going to get a culture which works for us, but it'll be very different to the one down the road, or it'll be different. Geelong's had a great culture, Hawthorn's had a great culture, the Swans have had a great culture, Brisbane have had a great culture, but I can guarantee they're all different in their own way. And that's okay. We've got to create a culture which works for us.
The words that kind of stuck out to me, and again, talk about culture, and then it becomes about the principles. Well, the people who need to show great principles become the leaders. And without a great leader, you probably struggle to have, a well-run, great organization, whether a football club or a business. I guess then over your time and in the work you do now, when you talk about, forming great leaders, coaching great leaders, pretty broad again, but what in your view makes a great leader? And I know you touched on the word authenticity, and then there's vulnerability. But from the work you do, what do you see as the key parts of being a great leader?
They know who they are. They absolutely know who they are. They do the work to know who they are. And it's, I bring this, but I don't bring that. To realize that you're not the smartest person in the room, there's going to be, there's going to be some things you're going to have insight into and others that you're not. To recognize that you may be being experienced in ways that are different to your intention. And if you're not careful, you'll be the last person to ever find that out. So, I've got a book which I'm writing at the moment. No one tells the CEO their baby's ugly. That it is, if you're not careful, you can just operate in isolation of. And so if you can't do the work and be clear on who you are and what you bring, I don't think you can lead. And it was that idea which, perhaps, when I went to Richmond as a young person, is that I almost created some avatar of what I thought a leader should be. Because 24, and we'd often get reminded of this, the male brain doesn't really kick in until between 25 and 30 in a true sense. And that's not being unkind, but I think it's just evolution, really. And you're asked, is it certainly less than a fully formed boy? So I had a certain level of maturity and understanding and insight into aspects of the role, but clearly I didn't know who I was. And it was actually a wonderful person by the name of Francis Burke, great Richmond player, who coached Richmond, who coached only for 2 years, one of which was a grand final, and then coached them out of the finals and got the sack the next year, like one of the greatest ever to play for Richmond. And he said, and I talked to him, and I almost was coming from this place of empathy, and, you were really unlucky you got sacked after 2 years. He said, no, I wasn't. No, I wasn't. He said, maybe I would have learnt this. He said, but the lesson I learnt was that every time I faced into a situation, I'd ask, what would Ron Barassi do? Or what would David Parkin do? What would Tom Hafey do? What would one of these great coaches do? The question I never asked myself is, what should Francis Burke do? And I remember hearing that, thinking he was this guy who I'd put on this enormous pedestal, and there's wonderful vulnerability in what he was actually saying there, who he's such a revered figure at the football club. They call him Saint Francis, he's just, and he's now well into his 70s. And, I live in Dalesford, and I rang him one day, and I was just leaving Melbourne, and I was still talking to him as my car pulled into the garage in Dalesford, like an hour and a half later. And it's these sorts of conversations that we have. And so he's a guy who, even with everything that he'd done, he was basically saying he wasn't sure what he brought. And so how could he coach or take on such a big role without that sense? And maybe that penny would have dropped if they'd given him more time. And I'm certain that it perhaps would have, but that's his humility in saying that. So the first thing you have to do is figure out who you are. If you can't put into the work into figuring out who you are, if it's not happening in you, it won't happen through you. And we externalize it so much because there's so many things that we can be measured by. We can be measured by wins and losses, profit and loss, all those sorts of factors. But the most important measurement is how people are experiencing you. And if they're experiencing you in some way other than what the organisation needs of you and expects of you and requires of you to lead it during whatever phase of its development that it is, well, there's almost no means that can actually achieve it. And I don't think any organisation can outperform its leadership. Mm. And so much of that sits with the CEO. Is the CEO leading in a way which is aligned to this? Is the CEO clear? Are we clear on who we are and why we do it? Are we clear on what does winning look like? Are we clear on what we need to be good at? Those 4 questions. Who we are, why we do it, what does winning look like, what do we need to be good at? They're really very basic questions, and there needs to be a story around those things which is compelling enough for the people in the organisation to say, yeah, I believe in that and I'm prepared to align my career to that. I have my own podcast, and it was with Paul Marsh, who has been the CEO of the AFL Players Association, and he's now CEO of the Australian Cricket Association, of which he was previously as well. And he's a fascinating fella. So he's undertaking to the players is, we'll look after your wages, yeah. We'll look after your workplace, yeah, but we'll also look after your well-being. And I'm thinking, mate, isn't that just a wonderful framework to use? Yeah, if you come and work for us, you'll get well paid, you'll get looked after, yeah, that you won't miss out there. But with your workplace, it's going to be a great place to work. And in sport, the workplace has a different connotation because it has the potential of being unsafe. Like an Adam Goods scenario, it became unsafe, really. He's getting in that way. But then the fact that the workplace was unsafe, but then it impacts on well-being. And I'm thinking, so here's the CEO that he says they're the things I bring. And with these 800, 900 players whose careers are aligned to that, for that short period of their lives, and the most, obviously very impactful periods of their lives. Just to have that, isn't that just a beautiful framing? We're going to look after your wages, you'll get well paid, but we're going to look after your workplace so you feel good about all the things that it's going to ask of you. But we're also going to look after your well-being, because it will get hard. You will have to, at some stage, create a new identity for yourself when the game is done with you. The game will be done with everyone before they're done with it. Mostly, yeah. And most careers in football end because of a coach or a doctor tells you it's time to go.
Yeah, there's a lot that in my own head I'm unpacking there, just going like, they're looking after your well-being in the workplace, and how what being in that environment is like, because there are a lot of hard days in business, in small business and organizations. Yeah. Like, I think in the last couple of months alone, there's been some days where I've sat back and just gone, like, I don't know if I can keep going. I don't know if I want to do this anymore. I don't know if I can keep going. And that's as the leader, like being, raw, vulnerable. Like, there's been some pretty, and then it's then rocking up the next day and showing, what is the purpose? What is the plan? What is the mission? And why am I here? And what, how do I show up? But, I think sometimes there's a bit of that, a feeling of vulnerability can be weakness. Like if I'm vulnerable to my team that, hey, it's been a tough week for me. Like I've dealt with some shit. I'm not, I'm not feeling the greatest about it all, but I've still got to show up as the leader. But yeah, so I suppose like that vulnerability side versus being a great leader, and is there a world where you can be both? You can be vulnerable and still be a great leader.
Yeah, no, I think there is. The thing we have to be most vulnerable about is the errors we make, because we will make them. And so as a CEO, if you're prepared to bring your errors into the room, I think there's two benefits to that. The first one is you're modeling the expectation and the understanding that people do bring their mistakes into the room. Because one, we have to know about them, and two, we have to learn from them. And so in learning from them, if the CEO brings their mistakes into the room, one of the things I find fascinating in business is that in sport, we have no hesitation of coaching players in front of each other. So if Jason makes an error, it's talked about in front of Nick. And we do that not to make Jason look bad, but to make sure that Nick learns the same lesson that Jason's learning. It's not, and we don't personalize it, because the game's complex. The game you get rattled, certain things, and so I can assure you that if Jason's getting feedback in front of the group, there's another 5 or 6 players in the room going, shit, I didn't know that either. I would have made the same mistake. But in business, we're much less likely to do that. And I understand why. But if you're the CEO and you stand up and say, look, I zigged when I should have zagged. This was my thinking at the time. My thinking actually was flawed. I was operating with imperfect information, because if there's perfect information, we don't have to make a decision. The decision's made for us. Leadership's in the business of ambiguity. The only reason we need leadership is because it gets ambiguous. If it's certain, we don't need leadership. That's just reality. And so you bring your mistakes into the room. The All Blacks have a wonderful way of thinking about it. They say we carve our mistakes into the wall. We carve our mistakes into the wall because we want people who aren't in this room to learn from those errors. That's what legacy, that's carrying the weight forward, if you like. And so yes, that will require the being the not knower from, whereas this first inclination when I became a CEO was I could ride in on my white horse as the person with all the answers. I'm 24 years of age, I've got no context for, and as I spoke about, the issues that Richmond were facing were financial as much as they were team performance. And here's a bloke who's got no finance background at all, who's, trying to fix that problem or play a role in fixing that problem. And so it is, and even in those moments, I don't think you've led unless you've woken up in the morning and your first thought's fuck. I don't think you've ever had a leadership role unless you've had that sense of it, And so and I coach Michael Voss at Carlton. I do coaching work with him. He's a coach at Carlton. And he's had a pretty challenging few weeks, I can guarantee people's experiences of Michael, he'll probably be showing the signs that it's been pretty tough, because that's just human nature. But if you were to measure him on one thing and one thing only, and that's how he's showing up, I can guarantee it would be a positive experience, because that's what leadership will ask of you. Because the reason we wake up in the morning with that feeling, the first thought's fuck, is that it's our emotional response to something happening inside us in response to something which is happening around us. But you're the only person who's experiencing the inside us. So, what we see and hear affects how we think and feel, but we're measured by what we say and do. And that's why you do the work on you. So you can, every so often, it's about gritting the teeth and moving forward. I get that. But it's gritting the teeth and moving forward as a human, not as a robot, not in pretend mode. And to actually come into the room and say, look, mate, I'm feeling this. Don't worry about that. I'm feeling it. But I can tell you what, I can look around this room and I can see the future. The future's in this room. And if the solution's not there for us now, I'm pretty bloody sure if we dig deep enough, it's in this room somewhere. And that's all you can do. Yeah. And, it's not trying not to think. If you think you got the answer, take it forward. But you only ever bring one imagination to your own life, one set of ears, one set of eyes. The goal as leaders is create conditions and create an environment where we can draw on the collective imaginations of everyone in the room, because everyone's committed to bringing their imagination into the room. They're not fearful of that. They're not fearful of being wrong. It's not about getting your idea. It's actually about getting the best idea. And your idea might be the best idea, but we want the best idea, not your idea. But we need to hear your idea to get the best idea.
Yeah, and I can really relate to that. And it's just as a practical example, like I'm 43 this year, and our industry is going through a mass, like a lot of industries are, a massive change in relation to tech and mainly AI. And most of the leaders in this business are way smarter than me, particularly in regards to that. And I've kind of just become this sounding board to almost just decipher, okay, we're thinking this, we're thinking that, and get them all in a room. And because I have got a lot of incredible young people in here, we have another little group where all those leaders come together and discuss things. But I'm thinking about what you're saying, because I can relate to it. Some of these young people are just super smart, and I'm just there trying to take it all in and digest what they're saying, and then point them in the right direction, or challenge them on things, and even make them challenge each other. So yeah, that was that was me, for sure.
Well, you've touched on a couple of really important things there. So even with coaching and this would be for anyone who's listening, these are, so even if I'm coaching Michael Voss, okay, so we're in a situation, we're having a conversation. There's 4 postures that I take. The first one is I'm a sounding board. Yeah, I'm a sounding board. But the sounding board does rely on the person you're listening to have or almost a fully formed idea, which they can then articulate in a really clear way. Yeah, there's no point being a sounding board for someone who hasn't thought about it, as an example. They need to have given it a lot of thought. So don't ask me to be a sounding board unless you've given it a lot of thought.
Yeah.
In many ways.
Yeah.
The second one is, okay, it might be that you realise that it's not a fully formed idea, that there was a whole lot of things that could have been included in that thought process, which means that you do become a bit of the truth teller, which you touched upon, is to actually say, it's like people would come into the room and say, I'm the CFO, I'd like to be the COO. And what that means is I'd like to take this work from you as the CEO, and I'd like to do more of that stuff over there. Okay, that sounds like a good idea, except I actually like the stuff you want to take from me. I enjoy doing that shit, so that doesn't really work. So you might want to give that a bit more thought. And the reason why you had F in your title as CFO was the F is pretty important for us.
Yeah.
So who's going to do the F?
Yeah.
So don't come into the room and tell me your own ambition unless you understand and recognise that a senior leader inside this organisation will recognise that there's upstream and downstream in anything that we're going to do. So often that might be then I'm now the truth teller. But I still like the fact that the person's got the ambition that they've got. That's okay. Now I'm now an idea sharer. So the first of the 3 postures, the first one is sounding board, the next one is truth teller, the third one is I'm now an idea sharer. I will now give the person something to think about, some ideas, some frameworks, some other thoughts. And then we can have a conversation around those ideas, and often it's a model or it's a story, it could be anything. Yeah, and Jason's heard me speak. I use story as the core of the way I communicate. And then the fourth posture is I might just be a partner with the person. Let's just sit and talk about it. You haven't got the answer. I haven't got the answer. Let's try and work this one out together. And so I really recommend those 4 postures for leaders, sounding board, truth teller, idea sharer, partner. And what would the whole idea of that is to go from, to land at what we think is the best idea. And that's the same inside, a team-based environment as well. But to get to best idea, we need your idea, but we want it to be a pretty formed idea. Just don't throw them in from the cheap seats. If you're going to put an idea forward, make sure you can back it up. Make sure that it's coming from a good place, that it's not from a place of ego and that what you're actually throwing forward is also important, because we can waste a lot of time on shit that doesn't matter, and we don't want to do that. And those ideas of, can you back it up? Is it coming from a good place? Is it important? Is a good way of thinking about feedback. It's a good way of thinking about ideas. It's a good way of thinking about, almost any interaction that you have. I even think about with my kids, that, the amount of times I wasted time saying, oh, look, when I was a teenager, I did this. The last piece of information they want to know is what you did when you were a teenager, because they can't relate to that in any shape or form,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I've got so many different areas that I thought we would take this and wanted to go, but I'm glad that it's just kind of unpacked organically. But there was one takeaway that I had from your presentation at the CPA retreat in Torquay, and it's kind of stuck with me, and I'm keen to kind of unpack it a little bit, because I know that I need to walk away and do some work on it. But it's around the leadership trademark. So I was wondering if you could touch on leadership trademark, what that means, and what are some, I guess, the mantras or the steps that we can go to develop our own brand, I guess.
Yeah, and it is a form of brand, but it probably would be best described as an overarching principle. This is my core principle. And it's not necessarily something which will stay there forever, because I think we evolve and we change. Mine is and hasn't changed for the best part of 30 years, but it is, but its context has, because I'm older, different things. My role now as someone running my own business is different to being a CEO of an AFL club, and even having adult kids is different to having young kids, that type of thing. So my personal trademark's finding something, this idea of finding something. And it initially was one of resilience, the idea of resilience, and I'll talk to that in a minute. And the idea came to me, it was given to me by Neil Danaher, who most people would know but how I got to know him was he was coach of Melbourne. I was CEO of Melbourne. We appointed him coach. And he asked me about my trademark. And I really didn't have any context for it and didn't understand it. And he explained his trademark is, when it's all said and done, more is said than done. That's his personal trademark. When it's all said and done, more is said than done. And that was my experience of him as a coach. He was very much the doer. I will tell you these are the things that are important, but I will also back those things up. And then people would probably know that for the last 12 or so years, he got diagnosed a dozen or so years ago with motor neurone disease. He's formed a charity called Fight MND, and he's now raised $140 million as a dying man. So, and against the disease which is killing him, and he's had an extraordinary run from the disease perspective, and it's unbelievably tragic. And parts of him, obviously, because of the way the disease is, he loses parts of himself in a physical sense, every day. And so that's the resonance of it in that sense. And so the trademark, one of my favourite lines is, when I had the choice, did I choose courage over comfort? Did I choose courage over comfort? And it's really the conversation that we had, because leadership's going to ask that of you, to choose courage over comfort. And I think the best stories, and there might be combinations of these things, the best stories of our lives are normally one of transformation. I was this, I became that, through either my situation or my circumstance or a choice I made, but I used to be this and I'm now that. And that thing is progress. The next great story, I think, is one of resilience, as in I got knocked over and I picked myself up. I was someone who, was diagnosed with this issue. I lost my job. I talked about losing my father. These sorts of things, ones which will ask you to find something within yourself, which is the reason I used the word finding something. And, I'm really open about it. I got diagnosed with clinical depression around that time, and I've had to have that experience of figuring out who I am in the context of that. And probably more recent times I've had to deal with cancer. So they're things of which you have to then, find something in yourself to be. And then the third story, I reckon, is one of grit. I just worked and worked and worked and worked and found a way, So I love those stories. They're transformation, resilience, and grit. And I reckon all of us will have, one of my favorite lines is, it's the hard days that define us. It's the hard days that define us. And generally, drawing from those hard days will be that story of resilience or grit or transformation. And so the way I recommend people do it is they start writing their favorite stories just to themselves. And I do it in a way where it is the old-fashioned way, pen on paper, pencil on paper or whatever, just write it down. Put your favorite music on. I think everyone should have a playlist in their life, a Spotify playlist, which is, and you title it Mood Changes When I'm Feeling Fucked. Everyone should have that playlist in their life.
Yeah.
Because we know that music can change your mood. If you're into music, and not everyone is, but I think most are, and it generally will be some part of you which is, it'll take you back to a time, it'll take you back to love, it'll take you back to, I've heard a few of Jason's stories, a few bloody places he shouldn't have probably been at certain stages in the evening, when he was dancing the night away. But and then you just start writing. And I reckon you can almost guarantee a couple of things will come from it. There will be a word in there or a phrase in there, or you'll come across a quote and you go, no, mine is a story of resilience. I think that's what I would have the most sense of in terms of myself. But it's also, I know I've worked hard and I know I've transformed at different times. Even, say, losing my role at Melbourne, when I got the sack at Melbourne, is the reason why I studied art and created Design CEO. If that doesn't happen, neither of those two things probably occur. So finding something was really important. Finding something was actually finding identity for myself beyond the game in lots of ways, which a lot of, obviously, footballers have to do, athletes have to do. So it's choosing a time when you chose courage over comfort, then asking yourself, what did it say about you? And then asking yourself, what would be the words I would use to describe it, which I'm then happy and feel good about writing at the top of the page every day. To start my day by writing down this thing, to remind yourself on a daily basis of the best part of you. And then the next thing you do after you write your trademark down, this is only just a little 10-minute exercise every day, is you ask two questions. The first one's, what's important? What's important? Because what's important, I can almost guarantee, it's not in your inbox. It's not ringing you on the phone. It's not doing whatever. It's you making a choice that day as what's important. And generally, what's important might be also overcoming a fear. It might be confronting something. It might be dealing with something. And the second question is what's possible? What's possible? So what's important, what's possible? And just again, I do have that little playlist I'm listening to each day when I write it down. And it is a daily effort of figuring out who you are. Yeah, figuring out who you are. And it's the first thing I coach in with the leaders I work with. Yeah.
I honestly love that already. Like the having your own mood changer playlist. I thought of the two playlists that I go back to, and one's a mood changer for not the wrong reasons or the bad reasons, but there's a playlist we made for Mum's funeral. Mum passed away a few years ago, and that was quite a time in my life. But I'll go back to that when I want to be, remembering and feeling and kind of let it out.
Yeah.
So that's and then there's a Jason Case playlist we made around our engagement party and then our wedding, which was songs, of that. But but I think that self-discovery of what's the Jason mood changer playlist and being able to go away and make that. And then again, the trigger, the words that you use then, we talk about what's important, and referencing the inbox or the phone call. And it's so easy, as a busy person running a business, everyone's got stuff going on, but to go, it's the easy choice is to just get distracted with the inbox and kind of write back to emails or do that rather than what was the bigger, more important thing that I could focus on today, and getting that out of the way is the first thing in the morning or the first thing you do and what's possible. I mean, I think we naturally limit ourselves to what is possible. And rather than doing that, setting some big scope on what is possible today. What if I could get that one thing done that made me feel really good about, today was a success. And I think they're really easy, good takeaways for me, and a great one for the audience to kind of sit back and think about, what does that look like for them?
think the music one resonated with me because I am very much a music lover, but I've found the last few years I've gone away from it because of access to podcasts. And, if I'm ever in the car, it's a podcast, because you want to ingest information and learn. But I think one of the things with having a child is just separating that work mood, which isn't necessarily angry. It might be agitated, a little bit stressed, a little bit short, mind's racing. So it's only been the last couple of months that I've gone back to listening to music on the way home. And I didn't really think about it as changing my mood. I'm thinking about this conversation now, and that's exactly what it's doing. It was more just to, detach from taking things in and stop my brain thinking. But now that listening to you talk, there is definitely that mood shift. And I think I'll continue to do it because it puts me in a different mood. So when I get home, I'm happy and I can leave whatever stress I had at work. And I can really relate to the busy stuff.
The great saying from Seth Godin, who's a great podcast guest. If you're going to listen to a podcast, listen to Seth in that sense. I think he's just a wonderful podcast guest. But he's got a line: "Busy is the new lazy. Busy is the new lazy." And I love that idea. So I would say, in terms of the continual process, the continued things that we'll have to always overcome, are fear and lazy. And I don't mean the not hardworking form of lazy, because everyone who's listening to this will go, well, I'm not lazy. I work hard. I work X amount of hours a week and all that. But it's lazy as in the challenging work that you actually have to do, the deeper thinking work, the working on yourself work, the stuff which I would describe as easy to do but easy not to do. Like, it's not like meditation. There couldn't be an easier thing to do in the world than meditate. Like if we're going to invent the easiest thing to do in life, which will have genuine benefits, enormous amount of science behind it, meditation's got to be it. And people go, yeah, I've tried it, but my mind gets busy. I go, fuck, that's the reason you're actually doing it. That's the whole purpose of it. I can't stop it's like people think they can just stop their brain. Well, I think if you practice it long enough, you almost can in your own ways. But it's actually the effort to bring yourself back, which is the thing. I'm allowed to swear, by the way. I've sworn a few times, so just make sure that's okay.
Let's swear.
But the idea of, like, a great question for people is, we all have something in life we need to confront. I can almost guarantee it's not on today's to-do list, that very thing that you need to confront. By asking yourself today what's possible or what's important, all it does is elevate the possibility of it being confronted, the thing that we've avoided, the conversation we were supposed to have, all that. And so the lazy I talk to is, I think of leadership in this. Okay, I think you'll relate to it. As leaders, we are makers. Okay, as leaders, we are makers. And so therefore there's creativity in it, the word making. I find majority of leaders who I work with get their energy from making something. And I think these are the things I think we have to be good at making. We have to be good at making sense. Just making sense. Making sense from complexity, making sense from when things get out of control, making sense when the world turns in a way that we didn't expect. All of those, that we have to be good at making sense. I don't think you can make sense unless you're actually taking a little step back. So we'll talk about that. The second thing is we have to be good at making meaning. Meaning is what we're creating here meaningful enough for other people to align their careers and find meaning in it. And people might say, oh, that's easy if you're running a footy club. I go, but most of us just want, okay, what's the sense of meaning inside? It'd be based on ideas around connection, about doing something which is difficult, all that type of thing, getting good at something. The next one is we have to make good. We have to make good. We want the work we do to be good. People say, oh, well, why don't you have it make great? I go, well, making great, we might get to visit that from time to time. We might get to shake hands with it. No one, that's why it's so hard to win a premiership 2 years in a row, because it's hard to make great. You have to be great to win it, but you have to be consistently good to give yourself a chance of getting to great from time to time. And so if we just say, we're going to make good, and make good also has this idea, like one of the values of my business, Design CEO, is just goodness. I want it to come from, it's just goodness. I want it to come from a decent sort of place, a place of goodness, a heart type place. Then I think we have to be good at the next thing. So we've got sense, meaning, sense, meaning good. The next thing we have to do is make progress. We just have to make progress, because if we are motivated by a sense of progress, perhaps more than anything else in our lives. Why do people join gyms and don't go? Because progress is slow. Why do people stop meditating? It's slow progress. So it's the repetitive effort to make progress. It's the habits, the rituals, the James Clear. We don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to the level of our systems. Progress is systems based. I'm much more interested in system setting than goal setting. So I want to achieve this. Okay, what is the system which gives you the best chance of doing that? Because in my experience, design beats discipline every time. We might start out as discipline, but if you haven't designed a system which makes discipline easy, mate, the discipline's going to drop off. And we've all done it, And the last thing we have to do is we have to make numbers. We just have to make numbers. And there's numbers in everything. And people say, I'm working for a not-for-profit. What's the numbers? I go, mate, you've got numbers. Don't worry about that. The numbers of people we're helping, the money we have to raise to help the people that we're whatever. So none of those things can happen unless we make space. You won't not be good at making sense, meaning, good, progress, numbers, unless you make space. And all I'm saying with, a trademark is just make it 10 minutes to 30 minutes every day for the pen to hit the paper. Ask yourself, remind yourself of the best part of yourself by looking at your trademark, and then ask 2 questions: what's possible, what's important. And the 2 things you'll have to overcome most days is fear and lazy. They're the 2 things you'll have to try and overcome most days. Yeah.
Cameron, I reckon that's an absolutely fantastic place for us to tie a bow on this awesome time with you. But in doing so, I'd love, for our audience who's listened, there's been nuggets of gold the whole way through. I know personally I'm going to have to go back through and write down a few of them and work on them, not just the trademark and the 2 questions. But how do our listeners find you? How do they work with you if they want to kind of have a look at what Design CEO does and see if it sparks the interest of what they need in their lives right now? Tell us a bit about how we can find you and how we can work with you.
Yeah. Well, the business is Design CEO. It's and it is based on a lot of the conversation we're having, designing the system to CEO, if you like. So the majority of the work is with CEOs and their teams. So that's the core piece. Mostly it starts with the CEO, definitely. But I think the leadership teams and, say, partner groups within businesses, it's the most important team. The idea and the thing we talk about is it's the first team, but it has to be also team first. And I find partners groups, for instance, to be really quite complex when it comes to that type of thing. So it's working with them. It's on building systems of leadership, but it's also, means by which the individual does the work that we're talking about, today. So it has to happen in you, for you. So it's very much coaching, teaching oriented. I'm not an advisor. I don't even pretend to be an advisor. I don't give advice. I just share ideas. That's the core of it. So it's very much based on teaching. In terms of the stuff, I do put a lot of stuff out to the world. We've got a podcast called In the Arena. Had some great guests, everyone from Lane Beachley, champion surfer, to people who have been very successful in business. Has a sporting flavour because that's sort of the area that I can support and back up. Had some incredible people, to be honest. And I also have I send out a little email every week called Moments of the Match, where I still watch games and I see a moment and I go, that's a really good moment to articulate a piece of leadership thinking. That's the goal. And I also do some artwork which goes with it as well. And that'll be in a book at the end of the year. So there's ways of doing it. On my website, Design CEO, there's also like 30 videos of just pieces of thinking around leadership, which there's no cost associated with it. It's just there as because one of the four values of Design CEO, I mentioned one before, goodness. The other one is grateful, that I'm grateful that I get the opportunities that I do within the organisation that I get to work with. There's a funny little word we also use, and it's just grouse. It's got to be grouse. It's bringing back the old fashioned ideas around that, and it is still, I think having those little principles by which you in fact think about yourself and your organisation, the things that it's going to ask of you each day. So the 4 generous, grateful, goodness, and grouse are the 4. And they're all G's, and it plays off the MCG, because we're going back to the G, because I think probably the G's given me the most meaningful moments in terms of my working life, and probably my childhood in lots of ways. Those premiership cups I talked about before when I was a little Tiger supporter.
And what a special place. Unreal.
Yeah, it is. No, it's incredible. Incredible.
Cameron, well, thank you so much for having us. For those who haven't followed or picked up, that's design.ceo for the website. Go and check it out. Sign up to the email. I know I'm getting them and absolutely love it, and look forward to seeing it all come together as a book at the end of the year. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, Cameron. And until next time,
make sure you write down what's important, what's possible. Game over.
This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. The conversations are of a general nature and do not qualify as financial or tax advice. We recommend before you make any financial decisions, you consult a licensed professional. Individuals on the podcast may hold positions in the companies discussed.